Okay, everyone. I am Dr. Corrie Moreau. I'm Peruvian, but I also a researcher here in the National Laboratory of Scientific Computing in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This is the second virtual meeting of Systematic Biogeography and Evolution, SBE, the Research of Biodiversity and the Diversity of Researchers. Eu sou a Corrie Moreau, eu sou pesquisadora aqui no Laboratório Nacional de Computação Científica no Rio de Janeiro, Brasil. E eu sou peruana também, e, por favor, a gente está muito contente de ter a presença de vocês no nosso segundo meeting virtual de Sistemática, Biogeografia e Evolução, uma pesquisa para a biodiversidade e a diversidade para os pesquisadores. Bienvenidos a este segundo meeting virtual de Sistemática, Biogeografía y Evolución. Yo soy Corrie Moreau. Yo soy pesquisadora, yo soy investigadora aquí en Río de Janeiro, Brasil, y este simposio el tema de este simposio es la investigación para la biodiversidad y la diversidad para los investigadores. Well, welcome. The SBE Meeting 2021 aims to provide a high-quality international scientific event on systematic biogeography and evolution. We strive to make the event as accessible as possible to all people all over the world, despite the COVID-19 pandemic and other restrictions. Also, we want to promote diversity and gender equality in science and technology, agronomy and mathematics, and also medicines, STEAMM. Bem-vindos! Esse é o nosso SBE Meeting 2021. Nós queremos providenciar para vocês evento científico de alta qualidade em sistemática, biogeografia e evolução. Nós também queremos fazer tudo isso o melhor e mais acessível possível devido às restrições atuais da Covid-19. Nós também queremos promover a diversidade e a qualidade de gênero em ciência, tecnologia, agronomia, matemática e medicina. Bienvenidos a todos ustedes. Este es nuestro SBE Meeting 2021. Nosotros les ofrecemos un evento científico de alta calidad en sistemática, biogeografía y evolución. Nosotros también queremos hacer todo esto lo más accesible posible debido a estas restricciones de COVID-19 y para ustedes, para cualquier persona de todo el mundo. Nosotros queremos también promocionar la diversidad y también la equidad de género en ciencia, en tecnología, agronomía, matemática y en medicina, STEAMM. The organizing committee, this year we are 18 Latino scientists, 8 female and 10 male of 5 nationalities, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, and 17 institutions across South America, North America, and Europe. Be sure to send us a message if you want to join the meeting to our 2022 STEAMM. You can learn about that in the sbmeeting.com. Nós, como organizador, comité organizador, nós somos 18 latinos e latinas, nós somos 8 mulheres, 10 homens de 5 nacionalidades, Argentina, Brasil, Colômbia, México, Peru, e 17 instituições em Sudamérica, Norte América e na Europa. Por favor, se você quer fazer parte do nosso comitê para o próximo ano, nos envie uma mensagem e veja ao nosso website sbmeeting.com. Nosotros de la organización, del comité de la organización, estamos conformados por 18 latinos y latinas, que somos científicos, 8 mujeres y 10 hombres de 5 nacionalidades, Argentina, Brasil, Colombia, Perú y México, y 17 instituciones en Sudamérica, Norteamérica y en Europa. Por favor, si tú quieres hacer parte de nuestro comité para el próximo año, mándanos un mensaje y ve todas las informaciones en nuestro sbmeeting.com. Y aquí, resumidamente, nosotros, the meeting is a nutshell. We're going to have 10 symposiums from now until June 23. Invited talks will be hosted on Zoom, and each still has own link. Please see the link of the updated schedule in the chat. After each of the first 9 symposiums, we're going to have a virtual poster session on our Discord server. Please see the invitation link to the server in the chat. After the final symposium on June 23, the organizers need to discuss the details of the following ceremony later on that day on Zoom. Então, a nossa meeting, nós temos 10 simpósios até o dia 23 de junho. Todos eles estão hospedados no Zoom. Nós temos, depois de cada dos 9 simpósios, uma sessão de pôster virtual. Por favor, você tem que ver aqui no link, no servidor do chat, E depois de junho 23, nós vamos nos reunir para poder fazer todas as organizações para fechar o nosso evento. Então, no resumo, en resumen, nuestro simposio tiene 10 simposios generales hasta el día 23 de junio. Todas las conversaciones y todas las presentaciones estarán hospedadas en el Zoom y tú tienes que ver el link del calendario en el chat. Después de cada simposio, nosotros vamos a tener una sesión virtual de póster en nuestro Discord server. Por favor, tú tienes que ver el link aquí en el chat también. Después de este simposio, el día 23 de junio, nosotros los de la comisión vamos a poder discutir algunos detalles para poder hacer un encerramiento de nuestra ceremonia. ¿Quién hace esto posible? Who makes this possible? ¿Quién faz isso possível? Thank you so much. Muito obrigada. Muchas gracias a la Asociación Paleontológica Argentina, Asociación Herpetológica Argentina, Biomash, and Transmitting Science that are offering gifts to some of our best poster presentations. We thank so much to the UNC Charlotte for making the webinar Zoom possible without cost for the participants. Special thanks to Natasha Strassener and Madeleine Mesa León. Muito obrigado para a Asociación Paleontológica Argentina, Herpetológica Argentina, Biomass, Transmitting Science, y muy obrigado en especial a la UNC Charlotte por hacer este webinar Zoom posible y sin costo para todos nosotros los participantes. Muito obrigado a todos vocês. Y nós, this is our first symposium, Diversity and Inclusion and STEAMM Part 1. What the gender minorities and diversity matters. And then este es nuestro primero simposio, Diversity and Inclusion of STEAMM Part 1, What the gender minorities and diversity matter. E este eu deixo vocês, então, no nosso primeiro simpósio, e a nossa, the keynote, Professor Corrie Moreau, Ph.D. from Cornell University. I'm excited to introduce her, y este es nuestro keynote. La profesora Corrie Moreau, esa es nuestra profesora que va a presentar para a gente, Corrie Moreau. And thank you so much for enjoying the SBE meeting 2021. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very excited to present to all of you. I will try to speak slowly so that everyone can follow along. So why are diverse communities underrepresented in STEM or STEAM? First, we know that it's not a problem of ability or desire. We know that these people have the capability, the scientific and intellectual capacity to be important contributors to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We also know that there's disparity in pay among individuals. We also know that something called imposter syndrome or self-doubt often disproportionately affects people who are from underrepresented or historically excluded groups. And we know that there's something called the leaky pipeline in academia, and I will talk about that metaphor in just a few minutes. We do know that we will not fix these issues unless underrepresented groups stand up for equal opportunity, but it cannot end there. Overrepresented groups must recognize this as an issue and actively work to support underrepresented people and limit bias at all levels. So what is diversity, equity, inclusion? You often hear people talk about DEI. Well, I thought it would be good to define each of these words. Diversity is the representation of all of our varied identities and differences, collectively and as individuals. Where equity is the ensuring fair treatment, the equality of opportunity, and fairness and access to information and resources for all. While inclusion builds a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution of participation of all people. One thing I want to remind people is that if you fix one, you do not fix them all. So your institution or your department might have some amount of diversity they're trying to achieve, but just because you achieve diversity does not mean your work is done. You must still work to create an atmosphere that values diverse perspectives and values all perspectives equally. People often talk about unconscious and implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. It can be, we know that it's activated involuntarily or unconsciously and without one's awareness or control. We know that implicit bias is robust and pervasive, and that everyone is susceptible to them, even people who believe themselves to be impartial, like judges or scientists, and it's even been documented in young children. And if you think you're immune, I would encourage you to take one of these online tests at implicit.harvard.edu. There's a whole suite of different tests that you can take to uncover where your own implicit or unconscious biases are. And last year at the SOCNAS keynote, Carol Finney said this quote that I really liked. She said that bias is not the same as prejudice, and it's not the same as racism, but they're close cousins. And that's why we must be aware of them and limit their activation. So let's return to that pipeline, the metaphor of a leaky pipeline. So this pipeline is representing the percentage of women in academia, but this same pipeline metaphor can be used to represent any historically excluded group across any field, but we're going to focus on STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And in this case, let's imagine that there's water flowing through the pipe, and here we have this water of women represented at 50% at the undergraduate level. But what we see is that at each progression through an academic career, we're losing more and more women to once we get to full professors, we're at a very low percentage. Now, the idea is that at each sort of juncture between these academic positions, you have women who are leaking out of that pipe, right? The water is sort of becoming less. Now, I like this metaphor because it's easy to understand, but where this metaphor falls short is it seems as if those leaks are a passive process, as if, you know, there's just some unknown reason why they're happening. But I think it's much more like a sieve or a colander. We're actually selecting who can stay in academia or STEM and who should leave. And so it's much more of an active process of exclusion. So why focus against the bias against women? Well, one, we know that we have a lot more data on it, and I'm going to apologize now. Almost all the data presented in this talk today is focused almost exclusively on the United States. It's where I am familiar most with the data, but I would recommend that each of you look up the demographics in your own institutions, your own countries, to get a feel for how the bias is playing out there. We know that everyone can have unconscious implicit bias. We know that both men and women can be biased against women. We know that women are more likely to be subjected to inappropriate sexual comments and advances. And since women are lost at every level, that leaky pipeline metaphor, we must all work to encourage and retain them. I also like to argue that the women in science or women in STEM conversation is a gateway conversation to then be able to have deeper conversations around other axes of diversity that are often historically excluded from our fields. So in the United States, let's look at the proportion of people who are employed across all jobs. And what we see is we have almost equal representation of employment for both men and women. But now if we focus only on the STEM jobs, we see that suddenly we have far fewer women represented. Now, this is across all STEM jobs. This isn't just in academia. And already we're seeing it play out that women are being sort of excluded from these positions. And it's not just employment. If we look at a pay, what we see is that if you have a STEM job, you're likely to have a higher pay rate than those that have non-STEM jobs. But even within STEM jobs, that we see that women are making about 84 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man earns for the same exact jobs. Now, if we break it up by fields, we can see that there's disparity across fields, which is probably not surprising to most of you. And what we're looking at here are the non-tenure track faculty. And what we can see is that even in the fields that are doing the best, the biological, agricultural, and environmental life sciences, we still have only about 41% represented as women. But if we now look at the tenured faculty, suddenly we're seeing that even among the best fields, we're still doing very terribly. At the highest, it's about 22%. So this is a figure that was put together by some program officers from the National Science Foundation. They did this study to ensure that they were not having any discrimination on who was receiving funding from them. But before they could ask the question about discrimination for women and men for funding, they needed to understand the demographics across the major fields that they provide funding. So they need to know how many women were engaged and at what career levels. So what you see here is broken out by each subfield within the National Science Foundation's funding portfolio. The blue circles are men and the red triangles are women. And what you'll notice is that across every single field at the full professor level, we have a huge disparity in the number of women that are represented within these fields. And in many of the fields, even at the assistant professor level, we have great disparity of employment of women. So what we know from studying the women in science literature and looking at the biases and exclusion that's occurred, we know that most people associate math and science fields with being male and the humanities and arts fields with being female. That women in male jobs are viewed as less competent than their male peers. When women are truly competent, they're often considered less likable. That people are likely to ascribe credit to a woman than less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments. And on average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications. And I'll show you some examples of that. So hopefully you've come to realize that this is not just a women's only issue, that in order to reach equity, we need both men and women advocating for equity for women. Now, this doesn't play out just for women, this plays out for every historically excluded group, but we have less data for those groups, but I'm going to show you what we do know. So in the United States, white men disproportionately are employed in STEM fields. In fact, across all STEM fields, white men make up 55% of everyone who's employed. But you might say, well, this data is from 2006, and we've been very progressive in our thinking for quite some time. So let's fast forward almost 10 years later. And what we can see is that white men have shifted slightly down in their representation across STEM fields, but only by 6%. And we see no change in the employment of white women, and that we see only slight incremental changes for some groups, and some groups have had no increase in their representation across STEM fields. Another axis of diversity that we know often is excluded or has difficulty excelling in academia and STEM in particular are first-generation students and low-income students. So first-generation students are students whose parents did not attend university or graduate from college. And so if we focus on the first two sets of bars on the left, those are the first-generation math and science and engineering students, and then the first-generation humanities and social science students. Now, the color of the bars represent their income status. So from the purple is that they need full financial aid all the way through no aid. And what we can see is that the first generation students are struggling in their GPAs across fields, and that income status has a huge impact on your ability to excel within these fields. What I find striking about this is not just that the first generation students are struggling, but we're seeing that play out still with the second generation students. And that's an axis of diversity we rarely talk about. It's often thought that once someone gets a degree from a university, that they're prepared to be able to help their children excel in academia. But we're seeing that that doesn't necessarily play out. Now, if we look at employment status among scientists and engineers by disability status, we can see that if you have a disability, you're far less likely to be employed in science and engineering. And if we look at the representation of underrepresented people across STEM as full-time professors, you can see that even across 20 years of data, we're seeing very small increases in these fields. And even at its best, we see that we only have about 7% representation of underrepresented individuals across science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, suggesting that we're really losing some of the brightest minds by excluding them from participation. Now, what we're looking at here is employed underrepresented minorities by degree level in science and engineering. So the blue lines are individuals who have a bachelor's degree, red are with a master's degree, and yellow are with a doctorate or Ph.D. And although we can see all of them are increasing through time, we can see that we're still having very low numbers across all of these degrees, with the highest being around 17%. We also know that we're losing LGBTQIA students from STEM fields. So this study, we're able to demonstrate that retention of men who identified as LGBTQ were less likely to remain within STEM fields, although some women were more likely to persist. Now, this is troubling because these individuals are not dropping out of college. It's that they're switching their majors and still graduating successfully. There's something about STEM that is making, in particular, men who identify as LGBTQIA+ less likely to feel welcome within these fields. We also know that women, underrepresented minorities, and people with disabilities are still underrepresented across fields. And despite the fact that we're doing better for women across these fields, we still have very low numbers across almost every other axis of diversity. And even across these 20 years of research, we're seeing very slow increases. So women in male jobs are viewed as less competent than their male peers. When women are clearly competent, they're often considered less likable. That women of color reported that they had to confront negative racial stereotypes, and that Black women were more likely than other women to report a bleak sense of isolation, which I think is really disheartening. That Latinx and Black women are often reported for being mistaken as janitors or admins, and men of color describe similar experiences. That Asians report stereotypes, notably the forever foreign assumption, that despite the fact that they might have been in any country for a large number of generations, it's always assumed that English is not their first language. And that women and people of color are often held to higher standards of personal appearance and dress. So this is an interesting study. So a bunch of science faculty put together some resumes of a recent college or university graduate. And the resumes were identical. They just changed the first name of one of the applications to Jennifer and one to John. And then they sent it around to other science faculty across the United States and asked them to evaluate this candidate. What they said is that they wanted to hire this person as a lab technician, but their university required some outside evaluation of the candidate. And could they fill out a form? And the form asked them the questions: would they hire this person? If they hired them, what would they pay them? If you did hire them, would you give them professional development, right? So would you give them opportunities to learn more? And how much mentoring would you give them? And across the board, what we saw is that the male candidate, these are identical resumes, was more likely to be hired, was to get higher compensation, to have more professional development and mentoring. And this was true not just for the male professors, but the female professors also ranked the male candidate higher. Now, the business world has been evaluating these kind of things for much longer than we have in STEM, partially, I think, because the bottom line is the dollar, right? They want to maximize their profits at any cost. And so this was a study in which they put 4 resumes up on a very popular job board across several major cities in the United States. And all they did was change the names from Greg, Emily, Lakeisha, and Jamal, and then looked at how many times were those applicants contacted for interviews. And probably not surprisingly, across the board, the Emily and Greg resumes, despite the fact that they're identical, were much more likely to be considered for positions. So I've been in STEM for quite some time, and I've been fighting against these inequalities for a long time. And what I often hear is, well, we just need time. We didn't discuss these things, decades ago. We just need to wait because we're now much more aware of the issues. We talk about them. So soon we'll see equity. But even in these more recent years where we've been talking about these things since long before 2006, at this rate, we're only going to reach gender parity in 90 years. So we can't continue to do these passive things that we have been doing. We must all take active measures to increase diversity across all of STEM. So why should we all work to solve these issues? First, we know that there's not currently enough trained candidates to fill all the STEM jobs that are out there. We know that when we have diverse teams, it increases innovation, it increases creativity and problem solving, and it increases teamwork. And you're also much more likely to both attract and retain the best talent when you have a diverse workforce. And you don't have to trust me. We know that diversity is beneficial in science. So this is a study in which they assessed tens of thousands of publications and looked at the first names to assess their gender identity. And what they found is that when you had gender heterogeneous working groups, so both male and female authors, you produce far higher quality science than when you had all male authors. All female authored publications were in too low of numbers to be considered. So I think that should tell us something already. And across the board, they found that it was the work that had both male and female authors were likely to have higher citations and a longer impact in the scientific literature. And the same thing is true of ethnic diversity. It's been demonstrated to increase scientific impact. And even when you have diverse group of problem solvers, they're able to outperform groups of already identified high ability problem solvers. And if you'd like to see more examples of how diversity is beneficial in science or STEM, you can look at this blog. We also know that women and underrepresented groups receive fewer scholarly awards, and this is true across every field, and it's true across sort of career status. Now, the reason I bring this up is that each of us should be nominating deserving women and historically excluded scientists for awards, and not just teaching awards or mentoring awards or diversity awards. We should be nominating them for their scientific and scholarly work. Especially this is important because we know these individuals are less likely to self-nominate and less likely to ask others to nominate them. We also know that everyone must do this work to advance diversity, equity, inclusion. Currently, most of the work is falling on the shoulders of the underrepresented faculty who are having to play a disproportionate role in advancing diversity and inclusion. So we're now requiring them to not only produce the same quality and number of scientific publications as their peers, we're also asking them to shoulder a larger proportion of the service. So what are the barriers that are preventing success in STEM careers? We know that there's a lack of role models. There's a lack of publicity aimed at women and other underrepresented groups. There's a perceived lack of job opportunities. There sometimes can be a lack of encouragement or family support since they often don't understand the impact and importance of careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. When they are engaged in these fields, they often have a lack of support or feelings of isolation. We know that the lack of flexibility in part-time work can be hard for some individuals. Science really does have a white male-dominated culture. And we know that people from underrepresented groups often lack confidence and have imposter syndrome, and many lack mentors. But the great news is we can actually fix all of these. So how do we solve the problem? First, we must invoke and support policy changes that limit the effects of bias in our departments, our institutions, and in our own countries. We each individually have to acknowledge and work to reduce our own bias. We also need to work to reduce the impact of bias from others. And one way you can do this is through something called being an active bystander, and I'll walk you through what that means in a little bit. So one thing we can do is priming, so we can become aware of our unconscious bias and make sure that we're not allowing it to influence anytime we're making decisions. We need to reorganize structures and systems so that we create this consistency in how processes are carried out to encourage less biased behavior. We need new forms of accountability. We need to use these diversity metrics to check for potential bias and identify when and if there's breakdowns in the system. One thing you often hear people say is that they want to be allies. And it is really important, no matter what your own identity is, you need to serve as an ally to ensure that we're giving opportunity to everyone. So an ally is someone from a non-marginalized group who uses their privilege to advocate for a marginalized group. They transfer the benefits of their privilege to those who lack it. You can only be an ally through action. I like to say that being an ally is a verb, not a noun. While performative allyship is when someone from the same non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that isn't helpful or actively harms that group or person. And performative allyship usually involves the ally receiving some kind of reward on social media or a virtual pat on the back for being a good person or on the right side. I like these tips from Francesca Ramsey on how to be a good ally. First, you have to understand your privilege. And every person has privilege. It doesn't mean that you were rich, that you had an easy life, or have never had to work hard. There's just some things in your life you will never experience or have to think about because of who you are. So you need to listen and do your homework. You need to speak up, not over, and you will make mistakes and apologize if you do. It's not about your intent, it's about your impact. And that is very important. It doesn't matter what you intended, it's how it was invoked for the person who was receiving this. And again, remembering that ally is a verb. You can't say you're an ally. You actually have to do the work in steps 1 through 4 above repeatedly. And sometimes it's just showing up and being there for your colleagues. So what is a bystander? So a bystander is a person who observes a conflict or unacceptable behavior. It might be something serious or minor, one time or repeated, but the bystander knows that the behavior is destructive or likely to make a bad situation worse. While an active bystander, which is what I'm going to encourage all of you to do, is the person who takes steps that can make a difference. I want you to remember that if it's unwanted, it's harassment. And harassment is not just sexual harassment. Harassment comes in many forms: bullying, microaggressions, all of those things are harassment. And if it's unwanted, it's harassment. Harassment is always defined from the point of view of the target, and the intent is not important. So how do you be an active bystander? There's sort of 2 sets of strategies for in the moment and strategies for after the fact. For in the moment, you name or acknowledge an offense. You should always talk about the point of view of your own, not the target's. You should interrupt the behavior. You could publicly support the person that was the target, or remove the target or harasser from the situation. So I'll give you 2 examples. Let's imagine that this conference was in person, and this seminar was over, and we were at the poster session, and we were standing around the group, and one of our senior colleagues starts to tell a joke, and you can already tell that it's very offensive. What you can do is you can say, "Excuse me, Professor so-and-so, I'm going to stop you there. I find this joke offensive, even if this joke is not at my identity, right? I don't talk about how someone else might feel. I find this joke offensive. I would prefer you didn't continue." So you've interrupted that behavior, right? You've publicly supported the target. Let's give another example. Let's imagine we're still at that poster session, and you look over and you see someone who's trying to present their research at their poster session. They're very actively engaged and pointing at the figures, and the person who's there to listen is leaning in, touching the person's kind of pulling away. You could tell that it's something not appropriate. So you can actually go in and interrupt that situation as well. You could walk over and say, "Hey, I'm running to the restroom. I'm also presenting my poster. Let's go together so we can be back quickly," right? So you've pulled that person away. Or maybe you actually know the person who's the harasser. You could walk over and say, "Excuse me, Professor so-and-so, I read your last paper and I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." Just interrupting that behavior to give some space. After the fact, you should always report the incident. You can do that with or without names. You could talk privately with the harasser or talk privately with the target. In addition, there's lots of organizations who've been promoting diversity in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and as well as in STEAM. And I would encourage all of you to join one or more of these diversity in science groups. And if your own institution doesn't have a diversity in science group, you could even start your own. And I would encourage everyone, regardless of your identity, to participate in these groups. I belong to many of these organizations, even though I don't necessarily identify on my personal identity with some of these groups, because I know that being an ally and showing up and participating is a key factor in limiting bias. So with that, I'm happy to take questions if there's any, and I'm really gracious and thoughtful and thankful that you guys had me here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corrie. This was a wonderful talk. I love, because I think that we like scientists see the numbers, and and all this information was very, very important. I see one question, and is how is the data for other countries? And if you know, how is the situation, for example, for Latin America, for Asia, and how do you know about this?
Yeah, so oftentimes the people who are gathering these data are federal agencies. So you can usually sort of search online to see what your federal agencies, what data they're gathering. In some countries, gathering demographic data is actually not permitted, which is really unfortunate because we can't tell if we're moving the needle in the right direction without data available. And so, you know, it really depends on what data is available. I will tell you across the board, I am certain that every country has a diversity issue, right? Not a single one is 100%, you know, equitable and inclusive. And so really, even if your own country isn't gathering demographic data, you can begin to gather it at your own institutions, right? You can start to sort of take advantage of the fact we know who's being admitted each year to the undergraduate levels. We know what faculty are being hired. We can start gathering those data at our own institutions to make the case that we need to be more selective in how we're making decisions.
Okay, thank you. I have one question now, and it's like you are an experienced scientist, and how we can get ahead with confidence in our obsessed with competence. How do you think about this?
Yeah, so, you know, there's this thing called imposter syndrome, which means that you imagine, and it's especially true for women and other historically excluded groups, you feel like that you're going to get found out at any moment, that you're phony, that you don't deserve to be there, that, you know, you're not as smart as people think you are, or that you're not as rigorous with your research as you should be, right? Those are the feelings that each of us have. Recognizing that many times we're struggling with that is the first step. The next thing is to sort of gain new experiences so you can become more confident, right? Recognizing that many of our, you know, majority male colleagues are not struggling with these same things. And so we're essentially allowing it to undermine our ability to be successful in our careers. So at least for me, I still have imposter syndrome. I probably will my whole life, but I always like to remind people that for me, the way that imposter syndrome sort of surfaces is it's like a little voice in my head, right? Talking to me. Through my career, that voice has gotten quieter. It's gotten less frequent, and it's gotten less harsh in the words that it uses. And so just to remind yourself that you can actively change that voice, right? And so knowing when does that voice get invoked? So early in my career, it was when I gave presentations, right? That made me very nervous. So I forced myself to give myself lots of presentations, which then made it, I feel more comfortable and confident doing it.
We have questions about biases, and is there biases in the current research culture with the STEAMM?
Are there biases in the current research? Oh, yes, absolutely, right? One of the things, there's lots of data out there. So if you want to look, where people make assumptions, right, about people's ability based on their identity. We even know that even among small children, when you ask them to draw a scientist, they often draw a male scientist, right, in a lab coat, usually much older. But research has shown that when you expose children to diverse kinds, like this is what science looks like, right? If you expose them to all the ways that scientists look, when you ask them to do that same exercise, they now draw more diverse individuals as scientists. And that plays out not just with children, that plays out with adults as well, right? You can make assumptions about who you think is faculty versus grad students, which may not be true at all. You make assumptions about who might be a computer scientist or a physicist versus an art teacher. And so, you know, knowing that we have those own biases ourselves is critical. You really must know where your own biases are. Every person has biases. So knowing where they are is really important, especially for decision making. If you're going to go in and make votes on who to admit to grad school or which faculty to interview, you need to be aware of yours first before you make decisions.
Okay. We have questions about mentorship. That is very important now. And say, how can we fight against misogyny in science, like this Nature communication papers stated that female mentorship can be harmful without giving them power?
Oh, that paper is so problematic. I'm glad that it's mostly retracted at this point. That is, you know, first off, I want to say that being a good mentor takes work, We're never taught how to be a mentor during any of our education, right? We're taught how to do scientific experiments. We're taught how to write scientific papers. We're not taught how to be a mentor. So anyone who thinks that being a mentor just comes naturally is absolutely wrong, right? You have to do work. You have to make sure that you're creating an inclusive environment. It also means that you have to recognize that there's not a one-size-fits-all mentoring style. Each individual you interact with is a little bit different. You also have to recognize that if you have some identity, it means you cannot understand other identities. So if you're a male, you'll never understand what it's like to be a woman in science. You cannot, but it doesn't mean you can't be a good mentor to them. You can give them access to opportunities. You can be promoting them, right? You can also make sure that if you see any bias playing out or any sexism or misogyny playing out, you can stomp it out. You can say, I don't allow that kind of behavior around myself or anyone that I'm, supervising. So you have to be active in your role and you have to stand up for other individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I have a lot of questions. I try to join some. I think with the questions, and I think how from our areas of evolution, systematics, and biography, could we recognize diversity from the content of the course, or how we can make in the course that women will be represented?
Absolutely. We know that representation matters, right? Those are role models that people look up to. Those can be mentors. And so you need to empower those individuals to be those role models. So if you're teaching a course, even if you're not a woman or another underrepresented group, you can make sure that the examples you give are from diverse individuals. You can make sure the papers you're reading, the ones you promote as examples of good science, come from women and from other underrepresented groups, right? It's just exposure, we know, is one of the best ways to limit bias. And I will share that we all know that systematics, evolution, those fields are often very male biased, right? And so we need to think of every example of individuals who don't fit that identity and promote them. Invite them to give keynotes on their research. Invite them to be the heads of panels. And use them examples in the courses that you teach.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have here, how do we deal with institutional exclusion? That I think is the same with racism and misogyny, and how we try to deal.
Yeah. One, gathering data so that you can say there is definitely exclusion is important, right? Because if you confront somebody, they're going to say, no, not in my institution, not in my department, not in my lab, not me. Mm-hmm. But we know that it almost always happens. So gathering data is important. Education is really important. Mm-hmm. Require trainings on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. Don't make it optional, because what happens is the individuals who are excluded or who are already on board and are working to make a difference are the only people who show up. The people who are causing the issues often will choose to opt out, right? Because these are not issues that are important to them. Also recognize that people are on a continuum of learning about these issues. Some people have been thinking about them a long time or have been experiencing them for a long time, where others might be only learning about them now. And it doesn't mean that they don't want to change the atmosphere or environment. It just means they are still learning. So what you want to do is there's the people who will already be 100% in, and then there's the people who you can never change. And then everybody in between. The people you can never change, leave them behind. Exclude them from conversations. Just try to pull all the rest with you, because then they lose their power. And so once they've lost their power, suddenly you're going to see a lot of that disparity and equity disappear. Mm-hmm. These are all great questions, you guys. Keep them coming.
Yes. We have here. Do you have any information of any policy at national level that helped to change this scenario of disparity? Could you talk about this?
Absolutely. So in the United States, we have several, both at the national level, but also institutional level kind of efforts One in the United States is called Title IX, and it was actually invoked because there was disparity of women being permitted to participate at universities, in particular in sports. And so we recognize that that's, unacceptable. And so some federal laws were put into place to ensure that there was equity for men and women in positions. Now, many people have extended that to recognize that there still is an equity in sort of diversity across many axes, right? So whether it's ethnic diversity, whether it's disability access, whether it's religious access, whether it's LGBTQIA, that we have to limit, we cannot allow discrimination. Now, at many institutions in the United States, we have, when we want to hire a new professor, we have to sort of say, okay, we have a need. We don't have anybody with this expertise, or we want to continue to build our expertise. So we want to search for a candidate, and then you have to advertise, and then you bring in the people, and you're always looking for the best, which unfortunately often leads to disparity, because we know that people are more likely to pick people like them, which then sort of reinforces the stereotypes. But many institutions now have what are called targeted hires. So they're specifically to increase diversity in institutions. So you don't even have to do a formal search. You can just say, hey, Lena, she's a star. We have to have her at our university. Our department is low on women, or low on people of color, or low on people with disabilities, or LGBTQIA. So we're going to go and hunt that person and bring them straight to my department. And we're hiring them to increase the diversity in our institutions, recognizing that having the most diverse teams, the most diverse departments, is the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of, one, limiting bias, but two, having the best research and science and teaching involved.
And to try to join, it is necessary to consider the gender aspects in the evaluation criteria, and how it's possible maybe to think in the evaluation.
Yeah, for sure. So what we know is that women and other underrepresented groups are often doing a disproportion of not just regular service, but what we call hidden service. And what that means is that anytime a student is struggling, they'll often go to those individuals. So many times the work that those of us who are from non-majority groups, we're having to shoulder extra responsibility, which takes time away from our science, our grant writing, right, our publications. And so when we make these evaluations, we should use a holistic approach. We should be asking the question, not just how many papers have you published and how many research dollars have you brought in and how many courses have you taught, but we should also be asking, how many DEI efforts have you been involved in? How many committees have you been serving on, both formally and informally? That should count just as equal as the rest. And recognizing that those things are going to impact people's ability to publish scientific papers, or maybe to do sort of the highest quality science, they're still super valuable. It's how we keep institutions going, right? Especially institutions of education, where our students should be one of our priorities. So we need to recognize that we don't have a one size fits all, like publish 10 papers, check, got 2 grants, check. That's not the way to evaluate candidates. We need to do it holistically.
Thank you, Dr. Corrie. Says, how do we talk to someone that is defensive about her bias?
Yep, that's definitely going to happen, because people like to think that they're not biased, right? Everyone wants to think that they're, in it for the right reasons. One recommendation I would do is, the first time you talk to them, make sure you're alone, because people get really defensive when other people are around. Go in with your list of facts ready. Like, I want to talk to you about an issue I've noticed. Unfortunately, I've seen that you can let bias influence your interactions with people and your decision making. I've seen it the following ways. And since I know you, like me, want to have the most diverse and inclusive department, lab, institution, whatever it is, let's work together to figure out how to limit the impact of those. Now, hopefully that will engage them in the conversation, and you can share resources like, hey, I took this online workshop. I watched this talk. I did this tutorial and it helped me understand where my own biases are. I would love it if you did it too. Now, some people still may become angry or defensive or just ignore what you're saying. And then maybe it becomes a point at which you talk about it publicly. You're in a group or at a faculty meeting or at a conference, and you can say, oh, it's John, he's showing his bias again. Look at what he just did. He was demeaning to that person, or he's touching that person inappropriate. Call him out, because public shaming definitely can limit the bias, but you really want to make sure that you're trying to help the person grow first. Some people still are going to be incapable of that.
Okay. Then other about imposter syndrome. And is imposter syndrome an historical consequence of academia exclusivity?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we know that lots of people have imposter syndrome. It's just like a fact. We have to, I mean, so part of it's a two-part problem, right? One, it's the individual who feels the imposter syndrome. Now, a lot of times the reason they feel it is that they have had data reinforced every step of the way through academia that they don't belong, right? And we know that that's true. In addition, the other part of the problem is that the institutions, departments, and people involved in STEM are reinforcing the behaviors that make the person feel that they're an imposter. So what we have to do is we have to work to encourage those individuals, and not just, hey, great job, let's nominate them for awards. Let's make sure that they're getting access to opportunities to grow and build their own programs, right? Make sure that if you only can send one person to a conference, let's mix up who's sent. Ask them to then be responsible for sharing back when they come. Give them a bit of positions of power, right? Allow them to sort of feel ownership over things. So it's not a simple like, oh, just get over it, feel good about yourself. It doesn't work that way. It requires personal growth, but it also requires, as an organization or as a society, we have to recognize that we're putting undue pressure on some individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you a lot. Well, the time is running out. Unfortunately, we have 4 minutes to close this conversation. But we have other questions. Carrie, can you help me please with the other questions?
One question I did see is someone asked if they could add Spanish subtitles to the presentation. Absolutely. Feel free to subtitle in any and all languages. My understanding is this presentation will go up on YouTube, and YouTube has mechanisms for adding subtitles. So please transcribe it into as many languages as would be helpful.
Exactly. This is very, very important for us, because all the information that you introduce here, it's that the situation that we live every day in our lives, you know, and then it is important to distribute that in Spanish, and I can do that in Portuguese also, please. And then thank you so much. Okay, this is going to move my life. You know that the inspiration is nice. I'm going to read a lot of this paper. I am from computer science, and then this is that because when you talk about that, we feel that okay, which is going to be the position of we as women working with a man, with a etc., with a diversity, you know. How is our position? And sincerely, I'm going to read your papers. I am so excited about that. Thank you so much for this.
My pleasure.
Okay, I don't know if it's time, but really we invite you to continue with your questions and discussion of the rest of the symposium and in the diversity symposium too. And really thank you very much, Dr. Corrie. We love your work. Really, are you a good model for a really good model for women in science? And we can see all that you are working, and it's very inspiring.
Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you so much.